Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. I'm going to be going over the third video in the immigration series that I've been doing so far. The first one was applying property rights to the question of immigration. The second one had to do with welfare programs. This one will have to do with public property. So how does public property relate to the immigration question? This is a common way that libertarians that are against immigration and against open borders use to somehow justify restricting immigration. So I'm going to cover this topic in this video. So the first question that I want to answer is, what is the ownership status of public property? Who owns public property legitimately, if anybody? That's the first thing we're going to look at. Immediately, as has been explained in the prior two videos, we know that the government has no claim to public property, and that this is because all of their property is gained through theft. So anything that you steal, you don't actually have a legitimate claim to. So the government, right off the bat, doesn't have any claim to any of this. No government employee or agent of the government can lay claim to public property. So in the case where property may have been outright stolen, such as a piece of land, for example, where the previous owner can be clearly delineated, obviously the original owner has the proper claim to that property. So if you owned an acre of land and the government used eminent domain to take it, then the correct justice action to rectify that problem is to have that property given back to the original owner, which would be you in this case. So that would cover some of the things that we're referring to with regards to public property, but there's also many buildings, roads, things that have been built, or just things that have been purchased by the government through the use of their stolen resources and funds. So let's take those pieces of property now. Obviously, we know that the government does not own them, but in that instance, maybe money was taken from people and then that money was turned around and used to purchase or commission the building of a road. So what about the people that built the road? Do they legitimately own the road or the building or whatever it was that they sold or built? Well, in this case, no, because they voluntarily accepted stolen property and then relinquished ownership of the public good, the public property that is in question in this case. So for example, a road, government comes along, they steal through taxation a bunch of money from the citizens, and then they turn around and use it to commission the purchase of a road. So the people that built the road accepted the stolen goods and then relinquished and conceded ownership of the road. But the government, as I explained earlier, doesn't actually own the road. So it's in a state of non-ownership. Nobody has a claim to the road or to any other piece of property in these sorts of instances, which is what most public property is. It is unowned. So if we also look at the people that have had the resources stolen from them, taxpayers, or I was trying to think of a cute word instead of taxpayers to make a humorous joke about taxation being theft, but on the top of my head, I wasn't able to come up with anything. So these people have a restitution claim against the government. So the funds that have been stolen are the funds that should be returned, but in this case, they can't be returned in the form that they were originally stolen from. So the important thing to remember is that This claim is against the agents of the government. So the government, in order to actually have a proper justice restitution, the government should pay these people in return the amount that was stolen plus a reasonable amount for stress and so on and so forth, and interest, denial of the use of that property. But the government can't use stolen property to pay off this restitution debt. It's like if I stole $1,000 from somebody and I needed to pay $1,500 back to them, it would have to be money that I have a legitimate claim to. I can't turn around and steal that money and then pay it and then pay off this restitution debt. So the claim that people have is against the government, and the government cannot use stolen funds or property to pay off that claim. So the government cannot use public property to settle the restitution disputes with the taxpayers. So I mean that it doesn't really make much sense when you really think about it, to just be able to, well, we're just giving you this money, this property that we've stolen, and that's it. We wouldn't tolerate this sort of thing with a private person. What needs to happen is these government agents and personnel have to relinquish their own legitimately gained property as a form of restitution to the taxpayers. So the taxpayers' claim is against agents of the government, and this claim cannot be settled through the use of stolen public property. So these people, the taxpayers, don't have a claim against the public property. But let's explain this a little bit further, in that just because they don't have a claim, all that means is that we've determined that this property is in an unowned state. So all public property isn't owned by anybody. So that means it is open for homesteading. Now, obviously, it can't be homesteaded by the people that stole it. That would be ridiculous. Every thief could simply say, well, I stole this property from somebody, or I stole this money from them, and oh, we know that stolen property is in an unknown state, therefore, oh, I'm homesteading it, so it's mine. No, the government can't make people that were involved in the theft that the government executed cannot make the claim through homesteading against that property. So we know that the taxpayers and the people that built this property or sold this property don't have an ownership claim initially, but because this property is unowned, assuming that you are a person that did not participate in the theft of the stolen money, then you are perfectly free to go ahead and homestead this property. So how does this relate to immigration? Obviously, if it relates in this way, because the public property is not owned by anybody, there is no legitimate cause to use force to prevent someone from simply traversing across it. There is no claim that anybody can make within the realm of libertarian property rights to put a gun to someone's head and say, well, this public property here, you have to walk across it or whatever. We're going to prevent you from doing it. There is no claim to say that that can be done, because nobody has an ownership claim, because it is in an unowned state. Now, obviously, the correct way to rectify all these situations is for, obviously, the government to not exist. And once the government does not exist, all this property would be open to homesteading. People would carve out, via homesteading, this property. Many people would make claims, and then these homesteading claims would be codified and enforced. But in lieu of that, given the fact that the property is unknown, there's no legitimate cause for simply preventing people from navigating freely across it. So we get to the same conclusion as we have in the previous videos, that there is no legitimate case to prevent people from immigrating across public property into a given country. Having said all that, there are people that make the claim that, okay, well, given that the government isn't going anywhere anytime soon, we should just, people have an ownership claim in public property, and all of these things are owned through joint ownership, and that the government should manage it as perhaps like a trustee should. So therefore people want immigration to be restricted, therefore it should be, and it's an imperfect situation, but it's the best we can possibly do, or something along those lines, like that. Even though we can't bring about the correct solution, this is the second best we could do. Well, there's a number of problems here. Obviously, the first one is, as outlined earlier, it's dubious. This property claim is dubious to say that people jointly own these things, therefore we should restrict immigration into the country. So it's dubious on the grounds that this public property is unowned. But there's also some other problems. Another one is there are different levels to government. There's the state level, there's the city level, there's the federal level, and there's public property that is managed and funded at those different levels. So even if we accept the argument that these things are jointly owned and that somehow this justifies the restriction of immigration, again, as pointed out in the welfare video, people don't apply the logic that they're using on foreigners to domestic people. And here we have a supposed justification that means, well, guess what? The government can, the city can, should legitimately prevent people from outside the city immigrating into the city. Or the state that you live in should legitimately, well, maybe not supposedly legitimately, because we're talking about a situation that's supposedly that's imperfect. So the government of the state of, for example, I live in North Carolina. This joint ownership as a payment of restitution or as a second best option ends up justifying the restriction of immigration by U.S. citizens in other states to within the state of North Carolina. So we have this problem immediately. We've opened up myriad ways in which the government can abuse this power and can willy-nilly prevent people from walking from one city to another. So again, once you start applying this universally, you start applying these principles universally, you end up with these crazy conclusions that I find it difficult to believe any libertarian would really agree to. Give city, state, and federal government the ability to manage through force the movement of people within the United States. But this is the consequence of the public property argument that they make. So here we end up with a very uncomfortable conclusion. Another problem is, I hear this said that the government should act as some sort of trustee in its management of this property. But a trustee, it's a false analogy, because in private practice, a trustee would have the consent of the people that it is managing the property on behalf of. So let's say, for example, you live in a gated community. So the community manages common property on behalf of these people. And in this instance, that management could engage in actions that normally would be considered rights violations. So let's say, for example, there's a tennis court, and they say the tennis court is only open between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. You can't use it outside that time period. Well, normally, if somebody owns that property, and the people within the community in this situation do have an ownership claim to all of this property because they're the ones that live there, you would not be able to prevent people from accessing their own property based on what time of day it is. But in this instance, it's okay because these people have delegated various rights relating to certain pieces of property to the management organization. So the important point here is that consent has been given to the organization. Now, with respect to the government does not have and does not act with the consent of the people that it is governing. Therefore, it cannot engage in actions that, unlike, say, a gated community property management company is, in that case, can do things which would normally violate people's rights. The government cannot do that because it doesn't have the consent of people. It does not have the voluntary delegation of rights that, say, a private covenant or gated community might have. So it can't engage in things that violate people's rights, which, again, the restriction of immigration would be. So the government cannot act as a trustee, and to make this claim that it should is, to be generous, I would say it's dubious, because it simply cannot be done. You need consent to act as a trustee, and you can't simply get rid of consent and then say, well, we'll just pretend. Well, so this leads me into another thing where people might say, well, it's the second best option. It's an imperfect situation, but it's the best we can possibly do. Well, to say something is the best we could possibly do, we need some sort of criteria to make that determination. And we can't make that determination based on any sort of welfare, like general welfare of the people, or utilitarian grounds, or anything like that, because in order to make that claim, you would have to somehow have some kind of quantitative measurement of welfare or general utility. But we know that you can't measure people's preferences and weigh them against each other in a quantitative manner like that. All you can say is this person prefers this situation to this other situation, and that's really all you can do. You can't say, well, this person values it at 5 utils. This one values it at 6 utils. So we can use force to implement the person who values something at 6 utils, and utils is I just made that word up. I think I may have read it somewhere else in my many years of reading things. Let's just say utils is a make-believe measure for utility. So you can't measure these sort of things against each other. So there's no criteria outside of whether something is in accord with property rights, whether something is better or worse. You can't make the general welfare claim. You can't say something is the second best because you can't say something is the best we can do on the grounds that, well, it creates greater welfare than other situations. It simply can't be done. Once you bring aggressive violence and force into the equation, which, again, because the government is not acting with the consent of the people involved, violence and aggression is being brought into the situation. Once you do that, and Rothbard wrote about this when he talked about general welfare, once force is included, once aggression is included in the situation, you have to be agnostic about about whether something is better or worse, because you can't compare one person's preferences to another. So you have people within the country that would prefer open immigration and open borders, and maybe there are people that would prefer restrictions. You can't make the claim that one is better than the other on any sort of utilitarian grounds, because you have to use aggression against people to implement it. So even if, and again, this is assuming that this public property joint ownership is actually valid. So even if we concede all that, which again, as I explained earlier in this video, it doesn't follow. This is unowned property. Even if we concede it, there is no justification for preventing the immigration of people into the country. And so you can't make that claim on, again, welfare utilitarian grounds. But let's concede this even further. Let's take it just a little bit further. Let's set all of that aside. And let's say that people have joint ownership in public property. And let's say that there are restrictions on let's say that there's joint ownership of public property. So is that situation, even if we concede that, does that prove that there are proper limits that can be applied to immigration? Does that justify the restricting of immigration into the country? Well, the answer here is no. And the reason why is, and what people the argument that people seem to make is that, well, because everybody is a joint owner, then they have the right to manage that property within in the manner that they see fit. Therefore, there are people that want less immigration, and they should be allowed to manifest that through the government and prevent people from entering the country on the grounds that, well, they do own it, therefore they have the right, via the definition of ownership, they have the right to determine how it is used. Well, there's a problem here in that, yeah, some people would like to have less immigration into the country, but then again, there are other people who want to have immigration. So everybody who's in the country implicitly has the right to access the public property. So whether you want immigration or you want restriction on immigration, by via of the fact that you are joint owner in this public property, you have access to all of these resources. You have the right to use public roads, public lands, whatever. Simply by the fact, and again, this is according to this logic, where we have accepted that public property as some sort of payment for the restitution of taxation is now divvied up as joint ownership. So if I have the right to access this property, I have the right to use public roads, I have the right of free movement within the country, why can't I extend that to a visitor or a guest from another country? Why can't I simply say, well, I own the right to access public property. I'm going to grant that right because I am owner. I'm an owner. I own the right to access this property. Why can't I simply extend that right to somebody else, to a visitor, or to somebody who wants to move here, and say, because I own it, I have this right, I can simply let them use it. What's the argument against that? Well, I don't really see one, but let's concede even further. And I do want to say that the following is not original to me. I read at least the outlines of this on notreason.com many years ago. even if we concede all of these things, we say that, you know what? Public property is jointly owned by the citizens of the country from which the resources were stolen. They are the a joint owner has the right to access public property. Therefore, everybody outside of the country is prevented from entering. So even let's concede that only an owner has the right to access, and no owner can simply grant access rights to anybody else. Does this still, even if we concede all this, is restricting immigration still, is it somehow justified? Well, the answer is no, and I'll explain why. If I have an ownership claim to this public property, and I want to allow somebody to enter the country or to move here or whatever, because I own that share of whatever that claim is, why can't I simply split my ownership with somebody and grant it to somebody who wants to come to the US? And what practical limit is there to the number of times I can split that ownership? And it doesn't even have to necessarily be permanent, a permanent grant of ownership to another person that wants to come here. Perhaps they are only here, they only want to visit, they have a project they want to work on or something, and they only want to be here for a few years and then they want to return home. It could be a grant of temporary ownership as long as they are within the country. And then at the end of it, they return my ownership stake back to me. But even if they want to stay here permanently, let's look at the population of the country. What is to prevent me as an owner from simply declaring that however many people there are on planet Earth, I'm splitting my ownership stake that many times and I'm granting it to these people. Therefore, they are now owners in USA Inc. And now because they are joint owners, they are able to access public property and have the right to enter the country. So even if we concede, make multiple concessions to this idea that public property is jointly owned due to an imperfect restitution payment for stolen resources and taxation, even if we continuously make concessions, we can reach a point. We reach a point where there's simply no way to get around the fact that people should be able to enter the country. Because even if you make the preposterous claim that only joint owners have the right to access property, and a joint owner is restricted from granting that access to somebody else, you can always simply divvy out ownership claims. You can always split your ownership claim, and there is no practical limit. There is no practical limit to the number of times you can split it. 7 billion people, 7 trillion people, 7 quadrillion people. You simply put it in the denominator of whatever your ownership stake is, and voila. These people are similarly owners in whatever public property you are referring to and now have the right to access. So even if we get to the utterly ridiculous level that we have conceded, immigration is not, there is no legitimate reason to restrict immigration. There is no claim that can be made that can prevent people from simply moving into the country. And that is, again, this is with relation to public property. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about public property. Again, this is the third video in the immigration series. I hope this clarifies things for you. I have several more videos that I'm going to get into various other topics relating to the immigration question. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the 3 that I've put out so far, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great day.